The crystal chandeliers glowed above the long mahogany table, casting gold light across the polished silverware and the perfect Christmas feast. My father's glass caught the reflection of the fire as he rose from his seat at the head of the table. "We're proud of everyone here," he said, his deep voice warm, practiced, the kind that filled rooms and commanded applause. Then he paused, his eyes landing on me. "Everyone, except you." The sound of laughter stopped as though someone had cut a wire. My mother's hand froze midair, her smile stiff. I set down my fork and knifed the metal clinking against the porcelain and looked straight at them. "Thank you for being honest," I said quietly. "From now on, you won't have to be ashamed of me." I reached into my bag, unfolded a document, and laid it on the white linen tablecloth. "This," I said, "is the deed selling the very house you're sitting in." For a second, no one breathed. My father's hand slipped. His wine glass shattered against the hardwood floor, and the room fell into absolute silence. Outside, snow fell in steady flakes against the wide windows of the Whitmore mansion. The lights from the tall spruce tree shimmered faintly, their reflections dancing across faces, frozen in disbelief. Around me, my cousins and uncles blinked as if they had misheard. My brother David stared at the papers on the table, his mouth slightly open. His wife Harper whispered something I couldn't catch. My mother's pearls gleamed like tiny moons at her throat as she finally found her voice. "Grace, what is this?" she demanded, her tone trembling between outrage and fear. I met her eyes calmly, even though my heart was pounding. "A sale agreement," I said. "Effective next month. You'll have 30 days to move out." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace. My father's face turned a deep shade of red as he pushed his chair back, the wood scraping sharply. "You think this is funny?" he asked. His voice no longer carried that charming confidence he reserved for clients and guests. It was raw, stripped of polish. "You're bluffing." I gestured to the signatures at the bottom of the page, his, my mother's, and mine, all signed months ago when he had needed me to co-sign a refinancing deal. They had forgotten the clause. I hadn't. "You taught me to read contracts, remember?" I said softly. "You just never thought I would use that lesson on you." A few chairs away, someone inhaled sharply. My aunt's hand flew to her mouth. Harper whispered, "Oh my God," as if the words themselves could undo what had just been said. I glanced at my brother, hoping for a flicker of understanding. Instead, he looked away. I could see it in his eyes, the same silent loyalty to our parents that had defined his entire life. I wasn't surprised. I'd stopped expecting anyone in this family to stand beside me years ago. I straightened my back, the warmth from the fire brushing against my bare shoulders. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon hung thick in the air, mocking the cold tension that had settled over the table. I remembered the years when I used to wait for these dinners, hoping that maybe one Christmas they'd see me for who I was. A designer, not a disappointment. A daughter, not a mistake. But tonight, the hope had burned out completely. What was left was only clarity. They had built their pride on my silence, and I had finally learned how to break it. My father stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the document. "You can't just," I stopped him with a look. "You already did," I said. "You signed it." His hand hovered above the table, unsure whether to grab the paper or strike it away. My mother's eyes darted between us, panic rising in the space her elegance used to fill. "Grace, this is family business," she pleaded. "You don't handle family matters like you handled me." The words came sharper than I intended, but I didn't pull them back. "You made it clear tonight. I'm not part of this family. So don't expect me to follow its rules." Someone at the far end coughed. The tension felt physical, pressing on my skin, heavy and electric. I saw a cousin discreetly lower her phone. I knew the video had already started. They'd all seen humiliation before, but not reversal. I gathered the papers, folded them neatly, and slid them back into my bag. "I'll have my lawyer call you in the morning," I said. "He'll coordinate the transfer." My voice stayed steady, though my hands trembled slightly as I fastened the clasp. My father opened his mouth again, but the words never came. His pride had always been his armor, and for the first time it didn't fit. The fire hissed as a log cracked. Outside, carolers' voices drifted faintly from the street, a haunting echo of peace on earth. Inside, the warmth felt suffocating. I pushed my chair back and stood. "Enjoy your dinner," I said quietly. "I've lost my appetite." My heels clicked across the floor as I walked toward the hallway, the sound too sharp in the silence that followed. Behind me, chairs creaked, whispers collided, and then nothing. Just the faint rustle of the Christmas tree branches brushing against the window pane. I reached the front door, paused, and looked back once more. My father still stood there, his hand on the table, his face pale. My mother stared at the floor. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. The cold hit me the second I stepped outside. Snowflakes landed softly on my hair, melting down my neck. I inhaled deeply, the air crisp and clean, free of perfume and pretense. The driveway stretched ahead, lined with twinkling lights and perfectly shaped hedges, his pride, his control, his world. My boots crunched over the frozen path as I walked toward my car parked by the gate. Inside the house, the laughter that had once filled every corner was gone, replaced by the silence of disbelief. I opened the car door, slid in, and for a long moment just sat there, staring at the house through the windshield. My breath fogged the glass, blurring the windows until they looked distant, unreal. They had spent years teaching me that worth was measured by what others thought of me. That family reputation came before individual truth. Tonight, for the first time, I had measured myself differently. I had chosen dignity over approval. I had chosen revenge that wasn't about destruction but about freedom. The irony wasn't lost on me on Christmas night, the holiday of forgiveness. I had finally stopped asking for it. As I started, the engine headlights washed across the front steps where the wreath still hung, its red ribbon fluttering in the wind. Somewhere inside, I imagined my mother's trembling voice, my father's furious pacing, the endless attempts to rewrite what had just happened. But the story had already changed. I was no longer their disgrace. I was the one who had walked away and taken the ground beneath their feet with me. The road leading out of the Whitmore estate wound through tall pine trees dusted with snow. The sky was a dark canvas scattered with stars. I drove slowly, hands steady on the wheel, feeling every breath loosen the weight I'd carried for years. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller until its lights were just a faint glow behind me. By the time I reached the main road, it was gone completely. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I felt found. The photo on the living room wall had always felt like a lie. 4 perfect smiles framed in walnut, my father's hand resting on my brother's shoulder, my mother's pearls catching the light, and me half hidden behind the glare of the glass. I used to stare at it for hours when I was a child, trying to understand why it felt like I didn't belong in that frame. Back then, the Whitmore house in Portland was immaculate. My father, Charles, already had a reputation as the most meticulous architect in Oregon. Even at home, he designed everything like a blueprint, straight lines, precise symmetry, no room for mess. My brother David was his reflection. He followed him around the yard with his little notebook sketching boxes and lines, while I sat under the maple tree drawing flowers. I liked curves, colors, the way sunlight turned leaves golden at the edges. My father would pause beside me sometimes, his shadow stretching over the page. "Real artists build with purpose," he'd say. Not with crayons. Every December, the house transformed into a showroom of perfection. My mother hung garlands with military precision, each bow identical. My father hosted partners and clients for wine and turkey, and David, always David, was the golden child, the example of discipline and potential. I was the creative one, a title that sounded like praise, but was just permission to be irrelevant. When I was 12, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. That Christmas, David tore open a large box wrapped in gold foil to reveal a professional drafting set. My father clapped him on the shoulder. "For the next architect in the family," he said proudly. Everyone applauded. I remember smiling, pretending to share the joy while my heart sank. When it was my turn, my mother handed me a small rectangular package. Inside was a plain notebook and a ballpoint pen. "Maybe you can write down your ideas," she said lightly. My father laughed. "Or fill it with doodles again." The table chuckled. I felt my face burn. Only Aunt Margaret, seated quietly at the corner, reached across the table and touched my hand. "Don't lose that imagination, Grace," she whispered. "You see the world differently." Her words stuck like a secret one that I would carry long after the laughter faded. By 16, I'd stopped hoping for my father's approval. But that didn't mean I stopped trying. I entered an art competition at school, a citywide contest for student artists. My painting, a depiction of the Willamette River at sunset, won first place. When the letter arrived, I ran all the way home from school, snow crunching under my boots, my cheeks flushed with excitement. My mother was folding laundry in the living room. "That's nice, dear," she said, barely glancing at the certificate. "Maybe your father will hang it in his office." He didn't. That evening I brought the painting into his study, proud and nervous. He looked up from his blueprints, sighed, and adjusted his glasses. "Art doesn't build houses, Grace," he said. "It decorates them. Your brother builds." I waited for something else, anything, but that was all. I nodded and left the room. Later that night, I heard my parents arguing behind closed doors. My father's voice was sharp. "She needs to be realistic," he said. My mother murmured something I couldn't make out. I tore the certificate in half, but I kept one corner, the piece with my name, tucked in my drawer like proof I existed. Over the next few years, I learned to hide what I loved. I painted at night when the house was quiet, using the light from a small desk lamp. I stopped showing my sketches. They always said art wouldn't last, but when I held a brush, time disappeared and I felt like I could breathe. The summer I turned 18, college brochures began to arrive. Harvard and Yale for David. For me, a stack of state business programs my father had selected. He wanted me to study finance, something useful. When I mentioned that the University of Washington had an excellent program in art and design, his face hardened. "Design is not a career," he snapped. "It's a hobby. You'll thank me when you have a real paycheck." I tried to explain that design wasn't about doodles or paint, it was structure and emotion, color and function, but he didn't hear me. He never did. "You're not wasting tuition money on finger paints," he said. The argument exploded a week later when I told him I'd applied to Seattle College of Art and Design on my own. The acceptance letter came with a partial scholarship. I walked into his study letter trembling in my hands. He read it once, then set it down. "If you leave," he said calmly, "don't expect help from us." My mother stood behind him, eyes fixed on the floor. I waited for her to speak, to defend me, but she didn't. I turned away before the tears could show. That night, I packed 2 suitcases while the rest of the house slept. I paused by the living room wall, the family portrait still smiling in its frame. I wanted to take it down to erase the false perfection, but instead I left it hanging. Maybe they needed that illusion more than I did. Before dawn, my mother knocked softly on my door. She didn't come in, just pushed a small box into my hands. Inside was a pearl bracelet, one she used to wear to parties. "For luck," she whispered. Her voice trembled. I looked up, but she was already walking away. The bus to Seattle left at 7. I sat by the window, watching the city fade behind me, the skyline swallowed by fog. It felt like stepping off a bridge I wasn't sure would hold. I didn't have much, some savings from summer jobs, the scholarship, and the stubborn belief that there had to be a life beyond being invisible. My first apartment was a 1-room space in Capitol Hill. The walls were chipped, the floor creaked, and the radiator hissed like it had secrets. But it was mine. I bought a used easel from a thrift store and set it near the window where the morning light hit just right. When I wasn't in class, I worked at a cafe down the street, painting menus and designing flyers for local bands. It wasn't glamorous, but it was freedom. On quiet nights, I'd sit by the window with my sketchbook, watching the lights flicker across the city. Sometimes the ache of being alone crept in, but it was a gentle ache, one that came with purpose. I would trace my name at the bottom of each drawing Grace Whitmore, as if saying it could make it mean something new. Every Christmas I thought about the house in Portland. I imagined the tables still set perfectly, the garlands still symmetrical, my father still toasting to David's achievements. I wondered if they ever thought of me when they raised their glasses. But the truth was, I stopped waiting for that call. The winter I turned 20, Aunt Margaret sent a card with a small note inside, "Keep creating, sweetheart. One day, they'll see what I already know." I pinned it above my desk, right next to the torn corner of my art certificate. They became my quiet promises. Years later, when people asked me why I worked so hard, why I cared so much about every color, every line, I never told them the whole story. I never said that every design was a rebellion, that every brushstroke was a whisper against years of silence. But on the cold nights, when snow fell outside my Seattle apartment, I'd sit with a cup of tea, look out at the city lights, and remember that girl in the photo frame, the one who barely fit. She had grown up. She had drawn her own outline, one that no one could erase. And though I didn't know it yet, the same family that had tried to make me disappear would one day need me more than they ever imagined. The first apartment I rented in Seattle smelled faintly of paint thinner and coffee. The walls were uneven, the heater clanked all night, and my furniture was a mismatched collection of thrift store finds, but every inch of it was mine. I had traded marble floors for creaky wood and silence for freedom, and for the first time that trade felt worth it. At 21, my life revolved around two things: design and survival. I attended classes during the day, waited tables in the evening, and spent the nights hunched over my desk sketching layouts for imaginary clients. When the loneliness crept in, I told myself it was temporary, that one day I would build something that couldn't be ignored. My professor, a woman named Rena who wore paint-stained scarves, saw potential in me. "You build emotions into spaces," she said once, flipping through my portfolio. "Don't lose that." It was the first time anyone had said something kind about my work without an ounce of pity. I held on to those words like oxygen. By 24, I'd graduated and landed a few freelance projects. A small coffee shop in downtown hired me to redesign their interior. I spent nights repainting the walls, choosing warm light bulbs, and sketching menus by hand. When the place reopened, the Seattle Journal wrote a feature titled "Maple and Moon, the Cafe That Feels Like Home." They credited my design for its human warmth. I read that article a dozen times, heart-pounding, before forwarding it to my mother. She replied 2 days later, "That's nice, dear. When are you going to get a stable job?" I laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I expected. I printed the article anyway and pinned it to my wall. Every time doubt crept in, I'd look at it and remind myself that what I built mattered even if they refused to see it. Seattle became my sanctuary. I learned to love the rain the way it made the city shimmer at night. My apartment was small, but sunlight poured through the wide window every morning, landing on the old pearl bracelet I'd placed by my sketchbook. I worked, I painted, I dreamed. I thought I had finally escaped the ghost of Portland. Then, one cold February afternoon, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw the name flash on the screen. Dad. It took me a few seconds to remember what his voice sounded like. Still deep, still deliberate, but rougher than before. "Grace," he said, "I need your help." Those 4 words froze me. He explained that Whitmore Designs, the company that had always been his kingdom, was facing a financial setback. A major client had postponed a multi-million-dollar project, and the company needed to refinance to stay afloat. Because of some old estate paperwork, a small portion of the company's assets had been legally tied to my name. Something about a tax shelter my mother set up years ago. "You'll need to co-sign for the loan," he said, as if it were a minor favor. I wanted to say no. Every cell in me screamed to stay away. But a quieter voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to prove I wasn't the failure he thought I was. "Send me the documents," I said finally. The next morning, an envelope arrived by courier. The Whitmore logo embossed in silver across the top made my stomach twist. As I read through the dense legal jargon, I realized that my signature could determine whether the company survived. I called him that evening. "You know I don't have the money to cover anything if this goes wrong, right?" He exhaled sharply, the same frustrated sigh I remembered from childhood. "You don't need to, just sign. It's a formality, a formality." That's what he'd called my worth my entire life. Still, I signed. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving back to Portland for the first time in 7 years. The highway stretched ahead like a long scar cutting through the fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter every mile. I told myself it was just business sign, the papers shake hands leave. But part of me, the foolish part, wondered if he would look at me differently this time. The Whitmore house looked exactly the same, immaculate, polished, soulless. The hedges were trimmed to geometric precision, the marble porch gleamed. My mother opened the door, her smile brittle. "Grace," she said softly, like saying my name was an inconvenience. Inside, my father stood in his study, surrounded by blueprints and models, the same scent of cedar and ink that once defined my childhood. David was there too, leaning against the desk, his tie perfectly straight, his confidence effortless. "Let's make this quick," my father said, sliding the papers across the table. "The bank's waiting." I picked up the pen, hesitated, and looked at him. "You know I'm doing well in Seattle," I said quietly. "I've built a small studio," he interrupted, his tone dismissive. "That's nice, but let's stay focused." I swallowed hard, signed the document, and handed it back. My signature sat beside his, elegant and fragile, next to his sharp, dominating strokes. For a moment, I thought he might thank me. He didn't. That evening, my mother insisted on dinner. "It's been so long," she said, trying to sound cheerful. The table was set like an exhibit, linen napkins folded into triangles, candles burning evenly. Conversation floated around me about clients, projects, David's new condo. No one asked about my life. When the plates were cleared, my father raised his glass. "To family," he said. Everyone echoed the words except me. I stared at my reflection in the wine. After dinner, I lingered in the hallway, half tempted to leave without saying goodbye. That's when I heard voices from the study. "Dad says it's handled," David was saying. "Grace actually came through for once." My chest tightened. I leaned against the wall, invisible again. Their laughter was faint but sharp. "Well, my father said at least she's good for something." I didn't wait to hear more. I stepped outside, the cold air biting my skin. Snow had begun to fall, covering the driveway in white. I walked to my car, slowly breathing through the sting in my chest. When I closed the door, the silence felt deafening. The headlights illuminated the house, the same windows, the same golden glow, the same emptiness. I thought of how I'd signed away another piece of myself for their approval. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with a message from David. "Thanks for your help, sis. You saved us this time. This time." The words hit harder than I expected. I pulled over by the side of the road, staring out at the frozen trees. My breath fogged the glass. For a long while I said nothing. Then softly I whispered, "You're welcome." But inside, something shifted. The part of me that had always reached for their acceptance finally broke off and fell away. In its place was something colder, sharper, steadier. I realized that kindness to people who don't value you isn't love, it's self-erasure. The highway lights stretched ahead like a trail of embers. I drove through the night, the snow swirling around me like ash. Every mile I put between myself and that house felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. By the time I crossed back into Seattle, dawn was breaking over the skyline. The city glowed pale pink and silver, the air fresh and alive. I parked outside my apartment, cut the engine, and sat in silence. Then I whispered what I couldn't say to them: "I just saved you again, but next time I'll save myself." The wind rattled the windows, the world quiet except for the hum of the heater. Somewhere deep inside, the first spark of defiance caught flame. They didn't know it yet, but the girl they dismissed as nothing had just become the woman who would take everything they ever underestimated. The rain hit the glass of my studio window in soft, steady taps, the kind of gray Seattle morning I had grown to love. My coffee was already cold, half forgotten beside my laptop, as I reviewed floor plans for a new client, a bookshop downtown that wanted modern but with heart. Nina and Theo were laughing in the next room, arguing about color palettes when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen froze me mid-breath. Mom. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 years. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. Grace, her voice trembled, slightly polite but uncertain, like we were strangers. Your father wants to see you. This weekend. It's about the future of the company. I stared out the window at the gray cityscape. Is he all right? He's fine, she said quickly. Too quickly. Just come home. He wants the whole family together. I promised nothing, hung up and sat in silence. The city outside looked washed clean by rain, but inside me an old ache stirred. For years I'd told myself I didn't need their approval, didn't need their world. And yet, when the call came, I still felt the pull, the child who still wanted to be seen. That Friday, I packed a small suitcase and drove south toward Portland. The rain followed me like a curtain, blurring the highway and the memories I had tried so hard to forget. I stopped halfway, pulling into a rest station surrounded by pine trees. My hands were tight on the steering wheel when I called Aunt Margaret. You don't owe them anything, she said after hearing my mother's message. But if you go with open eyes. Pride can dress itself as love, you know. Her words followed me the rest of the way. By the time I reached Portland, the sky had cleared, but the cold clung to everything. The city was almost unrecognizable, sleeker, busier, shinier. But when I turned down the familiar street leading to the Whitmore estate, it was as if time folded back on itself. The house stood tall, every hedge trimmed to perfection, the stone pathway glinting under soft winter sunlight. The sight of it made my chest tighten. Mom opened the door before I could knock. She looked smaller, somehow same pearls, same polished smile, but her eyes darted nervously behind me, checking the driveway. You made it, she said. He's in the conference room at the office. He insisted we meet there. Of course he did, I murmured. At the company headquarters, I barely recognized the place. The lobby gleamed with glass and marble, filled with awards and photographs of my father shaking hands with city officials. One wall displayed a massive timeline of Whitmore Design's legacy. Every milestone was engraved in gold, every achievement credited to my father or David. There was no sign of me anywhere. In the boardroom, sunlight streamed through floor to ceiling windows, catching the silver in my father's hair. He sat at the head of the long table suit, perfectly pressed posture as sharp as ever. David and Harper were already there, their smiles polite and wary. Grace, my father said, standing. Good of you to come. I took a seat across from him. You said it was about the future. He clasped his hands on the table, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Whitmore Designs is entering a new chapter. I'm preparing to step back and focus on consulting. David will lead as CEO. Of course he will, my father continued. But we also want to strengthen our creative division. There's a role I think would suit you perfectly, creative director. The room fell silent. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him right. You're offering me a position here. Yes, he said, smiling faintly. A chance to bring you back into the fold. A generous salary stock. Options, a way to contribute meaningfully to what this family built. I leaned back in my chair. And the catch, he hesitated, as if he hadn't expected me to ask so soon. You'd have to dissolve your own studio, of course. We can't have conflicts of interest. My stomach sank. You want me to shut down Luna Interiors? Luna, he repeated as though the word itself offended him. A freelance brand is hardly stable. Here you'd have real influence, structure, a legacy. Harper added sweetly. It's a wonderful opportunity, Grace. You could finally be part of something bigger than yourself? I forced a smile. Something bigger, or something that belongs to everyone except me. My father frowned. Don't twist this. I'm offering you a place at the table. I met his gaze evenly. You mean under it? For a moment, no one spoke. My mother shifted in her seat, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her pearl bracelet. David cleared his throat. Maybe we can discuss it later. Grace just got here. But my father pressed on. You've spent enough time wandering. It's time to come home to do something that matters. A slow heat spread through my chest. What I've built does matter. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Luna Interiors. It's a hobby, Grace. You don't seem to understand the difference between talent and success. Something inside me cracked the same familiar fissure that had opened so many times before. I looked down at the folder he had placed in front of me, full of charts and project images. One design caught my eye, a sleek residential tower proposal. My own sketch. I had sent him that concept 2 years ago during one of my foolish attempts to reconnect. Now it bore David's name at the bottom. I felt my throat tighten, but my voice stayed calm. You used my design. He didn't flinch. The company refined it. The company, I repeated softly. You mean David? Harper shifted uncomfortably. My father's jaw hardened. You're overreacting. I pushed the folder back toward him. No, I'm just remembering. He stood abruptly, his voice rising. You are not the victim here, Grace. Everything I've done was for this family. For the family or for yourself? I asked quietly. His face darkened. If you walk away from this, don't expect me to offer again. Opportunities don't wait forever. I'm not waiting, I said, standing too. I stopped waiting years ago. The silence that followed was sharp as glass. My mother's hand trembled around her teacup. David's eyes darted between us. Harper watched with a strange mixture of pity and fear. My father's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. You'll regret this. I'm warning you, Grace. This family doesn't forget betrayal. I picked up my coat, slinging it over my arm. Neither do I. I walked toward the door, my heels echoing across the polished floor. Halfway down the corridor, a framed photograph caught my eye. One of Whitmore Design's earliest projects, a courthouse my father had built decades ago. At the bottom corner in small print, it read Design Assistant Grace Whitmore. I stopped, stared at it for a long moment, then reached out and brushed my fingers against the glass. My reflection hovered over the image like a ghost. You buried me once, I whispered. You won't do it again. Outside, the winter air was sharp, almost metallic. I breathed deeply, the cold burning my lungs but clearing my head. As I crossed the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of the company logo on the building behind me, bold, gleaming, impersonal. It didn't sting the way it once did. It fueled me. By the time I reached my car, the decision had already taken root. I wasn't going to fight for a seat at their table. I was going to build a new one. I turned the key, and as the engine hummed to life, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My father's words echoed in my mind. This family doesn't forget betrayal. Neither do I repeated softly this time, almost like a promise. Then I drove into the cold Portland evening, leaving behind the empire that had mistaken control for love and the ghosts that no longer had the power to define me. The wipers swept across the windshield in rhythmic arcs as I drove north toward Seattle. The sky was a dull pewter gray, the kind that pressed low and heavy, turning every mile into a mirror of the last. My father's words replayed in my head with each passing exit. This family doesn't forget betrayal. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the sting of humiliation still burning beneath my skin. But beneath that heat, something colder was taking shape. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt sharp. When I pulled into the alley behind Luna Interiors, the building lights were still on. Inside, Nina sat cross-legged on the drafting table eating takeout noodles, while Theo hunched over the computer. They both looked up when I came in, their faces lighting with relief. Thank God, Nina said. You look like you just came back from a war. In a way, I said, hanging up my coat. And I'm not sure it's over. They exchanged a glance but didn't press. That was what I loved about them. They knew when to ask and when to wait. The next morning, I gathered the team in the small meeting room. The whiteboard still had sketches from our last project, a coastal restaurant renovation. I picked up the marker and drew a single line across it. "We're expanding," I said. "Luna Interiors is becoming Luna Studio & Co., architecture, branding, interiors, all under one roof." Theo blinked. "You mean like a full firm?" "Exactly." I looked between them. "No limits, no ceilings, no asking permission." Nina grinned. "I was wondering when you'd say that." That afternoon, an email came in a city announcement calling for design proposals for the Harbor District redevelopment. The contract was massive, 6 months of work, multi-million-dollar funding, media exposure that could catapult any firm to national recognition. The catch: Whitmore Designs was already listed among the invited firms. I read the brief, twice heart-pounding. The irony was almost cinematic. "We should apply," Theo said, peering over my shoulder. "It's not an open call," I replied. He smiled. "Rules are just invitations for better ideas." I didn't answer, but I already knew he was right. 2 days later, Luna Studios submitted a proposal, not through corporate channels or investor boards, but directly to the city's redevelopment committee. We focused on human spaces, community gardens, co-working hubs, light, texture, and warmth. It wasn't grand or flashy, it was alive. The following week, the rumors started. A blogger posted that Luna Interiors had copied designs from Whitmore's archives. Screenshots of our past work, heavily edited, appeared online. The headline read, "Whitmore's estranged daughter steals from family legacy." I froze when I saw it. Nina stormed into the studio, phone in hand. "This is insane. They're using your own sketches against you." Theo slammed his coffee down. "We can sue." I stared at the screen. I recognized the diagrams. They were old drafts, ones I had submitted to my father during an internship years ago. He had kept them, altered them, and now they were being weaponized. My pulse steadied as anger burned clean through fear. "No," I said finally. "We won't fight back. We'll build louder than they can lie." The next week blurred into long nights and takeout boxes. We poured everything into the Harbor District design. The team grew: freelancers, engineers, artists, people who believed in what we were creating. The office was a mess of sketches and coffee stains, music playing softly in the background. We called it the Bridge Project. Not a literal bridge, but a concept linking the city's past to its future. Every design element represented connection: walkways lined with local art, green rooftops, glass panels that reflected both the water and the skyline. I wanted people to see themselves in the spaces we built, not just architecture, but belonging. Some nights, I'd look around at my small team and think, this is what family should have felt like. By the time we were ready to present, exhaustion had settled into my bones. The city council scheduled the public presentation at the Civic Center. When I arrived that morning, the atrium buzzed with journalists, architects, and investors. And then I saw her, Harper, standing near the registration table, immaculate in a cream suit, a Whitmore Designs badge pinned to her lapel. "Grace," she said with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, "I didn't realize you'd be here." "Competing? Are we participating?" I corrected. "Competition implies we're playing the same game." She laughed lightly. "You always were dramatic." I didn't bother replying. When our turn came, I walked on stage with Nina and Theo. The lights were blinding, the room packed. My throat was dry, but when the first slide appeared, our vision of the Harbor District glowing with life, the words came naturally. "Cities aren't made of steel," I began. "They're made of people. And people don't live in blueprints, they live in stories." The room went silent. Each image that followed showed sunlight on glass, laughter spilling from open plazas, reflections on the water. We ended with the phrase, "Design isn't what we build. It's what we leave behind." When I stepped down, the applause was quiet at first, then grew until it filled the hall. Harper passed me in the corridor, her expression strained. "Cute presentation," she said. "Thank you," I replied, smiling. "You'll see the full picture soon." The next day, I woke to my phone buzzing non-stop. The city's social media page had uploaded recordings of all the presentations. Ours had gone viral overnight, shared, praised, dissected. The comments were filled with words like human, hopeful, refreshing. By noon, an email from the Harbor Committee arrived. I opened it slowly. Congratulations, Luna Studio & Co. has advanced to the final round of consideration for the Harbor District project. I reread it twice before setting the laptop down. The room was still sunlight spilling across the cluttered tables, catching on rolls of tracing paper. Theo looked up from his desk, eyebrows raised. "Well?" he asked. "We made it," I said. For a heartbeat, the silence hung. Then Nina whooped, nearly knocking over her coffee. We opened cheap champagne and toasted from paper cups, laughter echoing against the walls. It wasn't victory yet, but it was proof. Proof that truth didn't need to shout to be heard. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the studio. The rain had started again, tapping gently on the windows. Across the room, the article accusing me of plagiarism still sat open on my screen. I scrolled to the bottom and saw that the comments had turned. People were defending us now, linking our video, pointing out the inconsistencies in the accusations. The storm that had begun as humiliation was already shifting into something else, momentum. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. For years I had wanted revenge, though I never said the word aloud. But sitting there in the quiet glow of the monitors, I realized something. Revenge didn't always roar. Sometimes it built slowly, brick by brick, truth by truth, until the people who underestimated you had no choice but to look up. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the wet streets. My reflection in the glass looked older, calmer, steady. I whispered to it, "We're just getting started." And this time the words didn't sound like hope. They sounded like a promise. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of the studio, striking the whiteboards crowded with sketches, mood boards, and pinned newspaper clippings. The smell of coffee mingled with the sound of keyboards and soft laughter. It had been 2 months since our Harbor District presentation, and the air inside Luna's studio felt alive, like we were building not just spaces but a name. Theo adjusted his glasses, scrolling through charts on his laptop. "500,000 visits on our site this week," he said, whistling. "We're officially more Googled than Whitmore Designs." Nina threw a paper ball at him. "Don't jinx it. You say that out loud and their PR monster will wake up." I smiled, sipping my coffee as I scanned the Seattle Times headline that sat framed on my desk, "Designing with Humanity, Luna Studios' Vision Reshapes the City." The photograph showed me standing in front of our model light, pouring in through glass panes, a quiet confidence in my stance that I barely recognized. I pinned a new rendering on the wall, our latest refinement of the Harbor District project. Below it, I'd written a single word in black marker: connection. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving that design built from empathy could outlast legacy built from pride. A week later, the first ripple came from Portland. David called. His tone was clipped. "You've seen the articles." "No," I said, even though I already knew something was coming. He sighed. "The Columbia waterfront deal fell through. They said our designs looked outdated. Investors are worried." There was a pause before he added, "Softer dad's not taking it well." My heart tightened, but I didn't say what I wanted to. That maybe for once the cracks weren't my fault. When I hung up, I sat at my desk staring at the skyline outside. The irony was cruel. Whitmore Designs, the monument to perfection, was crumbling under its own weight, while Luna Studio, the daughter they called a failure, was thriving on authenticity. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt still. The next few days brought more news. Articles surfaced about Whitmore losing contracts. One quoted a developer saying, "They're stuck in the past, beautiful but lifeless." Another mentioned the company's internal tension between the old guard and a younger generation calling for change. And then came the twist of karma. The blogger who had accused me of plagiarism was exposed as a freelance PR agent contracted by Whitmore Designs. Screenshots of payment invoices leaked on social media. Within hours, the narrative flipped. Luna Studio exonerated. Whitmore faces ethics inquiry. The city's official press release cleared us of all accusations, praising our originality. My phone buzzed non-stop with messages from journalists. I ignored them all, posting only one statement online. Truth builds slower than lies, but it stands longer. The post went viral within hours. That night, I drove south to Eugene to visit Aunt Margaret. Her health had declined over the last year, but she still greeted me at the door with her same mischievous smile. "My famous niece," she teased. "I read about you. You're giving the old man in heaven a headache, you know." We sat at her kitchen table with glasses of wine, the radio playing faint jazz. The warmth of her house felt like a balm after weeks of tension. "He'll never admit it," she said, "but your father was proud of you, Grace. Proud and terrified. You had what he lost, freedom." I looked down at my glass, swirling the wine. "Freedom cost a lot." Margaret chuckled softly. "The good things always do." After dinner, she shuffled to a small cabinet and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "Your grandmother left these for you. He hid them after she passed, said you were too young to understand." I opened the envelope. Inside were several faded stock certificates, all bearing the same name, Whitmore Designs Incorporated. My heart skipped. "Are these real?" Margaret nodded. 25 shares. Small back then, but now they're worth a fortune. And they make you a shareholder. I sat, frozen the paper, trembling slightly in my hands. "You don't have to use them," she said gently. "But power only matters if you remember where it came from." On the drive back to Seattle, the night felt alive with electricity. The city lights reflected on the wet asphalt, each one a fragment of memory, every slight, every dismissal, every word that told me I didn't belong. And now, somewhere in the tangled history of contracts and bloodlines, I finally had a key. 2 weeks later, the call came. It was nearly midnight. I had stayed late at the studio reviewing blueprints with Theo when my phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Grace." It was David, his voice hoarse. "Dad's..." He collapsed. "Stroke. We're at Street Vincent's. He's asking for you." For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of my heartbeat. "I'll be there," I said. The highway to Portland stretched ahead in a blur of rain and headlights. The wipers beat in rhythm with my pulse. I tried not to think, not to feel. But memories flooded in anyway, the Christmases, the boardroom, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. When I reached the hospital, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and lilies. My mother stood outside the room, her posture stiff, her eyes red. "He's stable," she whispered. "For now." Through the glass wall, I saw him, my father once, the towering force of my life, now small beneath the white sheet's wires, tracing the rise and fall of his breath. The sight of him broke something open inside me. David sat slumped in a chair, staring at the floor. Harper wasn't there. For the first time, it was just us. When my mother saw me hesitate, she touched my arm. "He kept asking for you," she said, "even before he lost consciousness." I stepped inside quietly. The monitors beeped softly, steady but fragile. His eyes fluttered open, pale blue and tired. For a second, I wasn't sure he recognized me. Then his fingers twitched toward mine. I took his hand. He couldn't speak much, the words came out in broken whispers, but his eyes told me everything. He had built towers of glass and concrete, but none of them could shield him from this moment. "I know," I whispered. "You don't have to say it." He tried to shake his head, tried to speak again, but I squeezed his hand. "It's all right." The machine beeped steadily between us, a metronome counting what was left unsaid. Outside, snow began to fall soft and silent against the window. Hours later, I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of cold coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The papers Margaret had given me rested in my bag like a secret. For years, I had wanted to prove him wrong. Now I realized I already had, and it no longer felt like victory. The next morning, as dawn crept over Portland, I walked outside into the frozen air. The city was still, the streets empty. Somewhere behind me, machines kept time with my father's weakening heart. Ahead of me, the horizon glowed faintly gold. I tightened my coat and whispered to the wind. The house of glass finally cracked. Then I turned toward the rising light and started walking. The funeral was small, quiet, and colder than the February wind that swept through Portland that morning. The church sat on a hill overlooking the city skyline my father had once helped build. Snow flurried softly against the stained glass windows, and every sound, each cough, each shuffle of shoes, seemed amplified in the stillness. I sat in the front row beside my mother, the scent of lilies sharp in the air. David stood near the altar, his eulogy folded neatly in his hands, his voice steady as he spoke about legacy excellence and vision. Every word felt rehearsed the way he had been trained his whole life to speak. Harper sat behind him, her head bowed, mascara streaking faintly down her cheek. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. The microphone waited on its thin black stand. My father's portrait stared back at me from the easel beside the casket, confident, composed, the same expression he'd worn in every photograph. I walked to the podium and looked out at the rows of faces. Colleagues, clients, a few old family friends. All of them had come to honor a man they thought they knew. My father, I began, was a builder. My voice was calm even though my chest trembled. He built towers, houses, entire skylines. But the thing about architecture is that you can only see what stands above ground. You never see the foundations. You never see what they're made of or who gets buried underneath them. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. My mother's hand tightened on her lap, but I continued. I used to think he built walls to keep the world out, I said. But I realize now he built them to keep himself safe from love, from softness, from anyone who reminded him that perfection isn't the same as peace. For a moment my voice faltered. I took a breath, steadying it. He taught me how to stand tall even when I wasn't welcome at the table. And for that I thank him. Because now I know how to build something that lasts. Something human. The words hung in the air. I stepped back from the podium, nodding once, before walking down the aisle, my heels echoing softly against the tile. Outside, the snow had stopped. The air was crisp, almost luminous. I stood beneath the stone archway, looking at the churchyard stretching down toward the city. The towers gleamed in the distance glass, catching sunlight like shards of memory. After the service, people offered the same polite condolences. He was a visionary. He raised a fine family. You must be so proud. I smiled, nodded, thanked them, but the words slid off me like rain. When the crowd dispersed, David approached. His coat collar was turned up against the wind, his face pale and drawn. He changed his will, he said quietly. A month before the stroke. The lawyer wants to meet next week to go over it. I raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, everything to you again. He didn't meet my eyes. Just come to the meeting. A week later, we gathered at the offices of Warner & Blake, the same firm that had handled the company's contracts for decades. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. The lawyer, a thin man named Harris, sat at the head of the table with a folder of documents stacked neatly in front of him. My mother sat beside David, her pearls gleaming against her black dress. I sat across from them, the silence heavy. Harris cleared his throat. As executor of Mr. Whitmore's estate, it is my duty to read his last will and testament, dated January 14th of this year. He began with the usual, the charitable donations, the scholarships, the properties. Each item was read with meticulous precision. The main house in Portland, the vacation home on Bainbridge Island, the majority of the company stock, all left to David. Then Harris paused, adjusting his glasses. There is, however, an addendum. It appears Mr. Whitmore signed a supplemental document 3 weeks before his passing. David frowned. What kind of document? Harris opened a sealed envelope, pulling out a single page. An amendment to the trust. His gaze shifted toward me. 25% of Whitmore Designs shares are to be transferred to Grace Whitmore, along with full creative rights to all projects attributed to her authorship. The room fell silent. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. David's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he said sharply. He couldn't have, he was sick." Harris remained calm. He signed in full health. 2 witnesses were present. I sat very still. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my expression didn't change. I simply said he knew what he was doing. David shot up from his chair. "You think you deserve this? After abandoning him, after everything I met?" His glare evenly. "I didn't abandon him, I just stopped worshipping him." He clenched his fists, his voice cracking. "He built that company from nothing. You don't even belong there." "Then why did he leave a part of it to me?" I asked, softly. He had no answer. Harris slid another document across the table. "The transfer paperwork will be finalized once the board confirms. You are both entitled to attend the next meeting." My mother looked between us, her eyes filled with quiet devastation. "Please," she whispered, "don't destroy each other." David exhaled sharply, pushing away from the table. "It's already done." He stormed out the door, slamming behind him. When the meeting ended, I lingered alone in the empty room. The afternoon light fell through the blinds in golden stripes, dust floating in the air. I thought about the last thing my father had said to me in that hospital room, the way he had gripped my hand, trying to form words that never came. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was what he'd been trying to say. Outside, my mother waited by the elevator. Her face was pale but softer than I'd seen it in years. "He always loved you," she said quietly. I shook my head. "No, he respected me at the end. That's enough." She reached out as the elevator doors opened. "Grace." But I stepped inside before she could finish. The doors closed between us with a soft click. That night, I sat in my apartment in Seattle, staring at the stock transfer documents spread across my desk. Luna Studio had been my rebellion, my freedom. But now, a quarter of Whitmore Designs, his empire, belonged to me. The thought didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity. Theo called just after midnight. "How'd it go?" I told him. He whistled low. "So you're officially a shareholder. That means you can walk into their boardroom any time." "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" I looked out the window at the glittering skyline. "Build something he never could abridge." There was a long pause on the other end before Theo spoke again. "You sound like you're planning a revolution." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." After the call ended, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat back. Outside, the city hummed softly under the winter sky. I thought of my father's last design, the courthouse he'd built downtown, its facade made of steel and glass. For decades it had been called unshakable, but even steel rusts, even glass cracks. And now I held the tools to rebuild everything he'd left behind. I set the glass down and whispered into the empty room. He thought he built an empire. I'll turn it into something that breathes. The snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the city in white. Somewhere in that hush, I felt the first spark of peace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but purpose. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a blueprint, and I intended to redraw every line. The church bells from my father's funeral still echoed faintly in my head as I stepped into the marble lobby of Whitmore Designs. The building was colder than I remembered, the air thick with the polished scent of cedar and control. Everything here still bore his fingerprint: symmetry, silence, and power. But now, for the first time, I wasn't standing in his shadow. Employees turned to look as I crossed the floor, their whispers trailing behind me. The girl who left, the daughter who'd been erased, the woman who somehow came back with 25% of the company. I didn't meet their eyes. I kept walking until I reached the elevator, my reflection gliding beside me in the mirrored walls, steady, composed, unflinching. On the 22nd floor, the boardroom was already full. 12 men and women, all veterans of my father's regime, their suits immaculate, their faces unreadable. David sat near the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, trying too hard to look in control. My mother wasn't there. Harper sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, like this was another social event. When I entered, the conversation fell away. Grace, one of the board members, said, standing halfway as though uncertain whether to greet or challenge me, Morning, I said, setting my bag down on the table. I understand we have business to discuss. David's voice was clipped. We're here to clarify your role. The will gives you a share, not authority. There's a difference. I smiled lightly. I know the difference, David. But it also grants me full creative rights to the projects I authored, and as far as I can tell, several of them are still being used in current proposals. The lawyer at the far end cleared his throat. She's correct. The intellectual property transfer is legally binding. A ripple of tension moved through the room. David leaned forward, voice tight. You can't come in here and dismantle decades of work. I'm not dismantling anything, I said softly. I'm redesigning. The board murmured among themselves. I let the silence stretch until it felt like its own kind of power. One of the senior architects, Mr. Lang, finally spoke. Miss Whitmore, the firm has stagnated. The last few quarters were unsteady. Perhaps some new direction wouldn't hurt. David shot him a warning look, but Lang ignored it. I glanced around the room. Then let's start with that. New direction. We can't keep pretending the world hasn't changed. Clients don't want glass towers that touch the sky anymore. They want buildings that feel alive. Spaces that hold stories, not just power. Harper scoffed under her breath. That sounds poetic, but naive. I turned to her. Poetry built half this city. My father forgot that. The room went still again. David's jaw flexed. You're exploiting sentiment. Business doesn't run on emotion. No, I said, meeting his gaze. It runs on vision. And right now this company has none. Lang nodded slightly, his eyes meeting mine. Then show us what you have in mind. I opened my laptop, projecting the screen onto the wall. Renderings of the harbor district filled the space, vivid, human, full of color and movement. This is what the future looks like. This is what people remember. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered, That's beautiful. David shot up from his seat. That's Luna's project. You're not bringing that here. I faced him calmly. You mean the project that's redefining the Northwest design market? The one already credited to me and my team. I can bring it anywhere I want. He stared at me, furious and speechless. Lang leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Maybe we should be paying attention. The meeting ended in a flurry of whispers and exchanged glances. By the time I left the room, the balance had shifted. Not completely, but enough. I could feel it. That evening I stopped by the river, the same place where my father had built his first office 40 years ago. The water glimmered with the reflection of city lights. I opened the small tin I'd carried all day and scattered a handful of his ashes into the current. You built the skyline, I said quietly. But I'll build the horizon. The wind lifted a few strands of my hair, carrying the words away. The next day I arrived at the office early. My father's old desk still stood in the corner of the executive suite, the same mahogany surface that had once terrified me. I ran my hand over the polished wood, then pulled open the top drawer. Inside were blueprints, old letters, and a leather-bound notebook labeled Legacy Projects. Flipping through it, I found sketches, rough outlines of projects he never finished. But in the margins, notes were written in a softer hand. My mother's. Phrases like "let the light in" and "space to breathe." He had kept them all these years. The discovery hit harder than I expected. He'd never listened when she spoke those words aloud, but he'd kept them here close. For the first time, I saw not just the man who controlled, but the one who quietly tried to atone. I closed the notebook and set it on the desk. All right, I whispered. Let's finish what you started our way. At noon, a message from Lang appeared in my inbox. The board has requested an official presentation of your redevelopment plan next month. You'll have full access to the creative department. Below it, a handwritten note, scanned into the document, read, "Make them see what we missed." When I walked into the creative floor that afternoon, heads turned again, but this time not with suspicion. A few younger designers smiled. Someone whispered, "That's her." I paused beside a drafting table where a nervous intern was sketching. What are you working on? He showed me a layout for a public library. Expansion, good lines, but rigid. It's fine, he said quickly. Just something small. I picked up a pencil and drew a sweeping arc across the page, breaking his perfect symmetry. It's not small if someone can breathe in it, I said. He stared at the line, then at me, a smile flickering on his face. Thank you. For the rest of the week, I walked through departments, talking to people my father had never noticed. The designers who stayed late, the assistants who made the deadlines possible, the janitor who said my father used to hum old jazz songs when he thought no one was listening. Each conversation peeled away another layer of fear that had haunted this place for decades. By Friday, the office felt different. David stayed mostly silent, watching from the periphery. I knew he was planning something. He always was. But for now, he was quiet. That evening, I stood in the empty boardroom looking out at the skyline. The glass reflected 1,000 city lights glittering like promises. Behind me, the model of Whitmore Tower stood on its pedestal, the company's crown jewel. I picked it up, the cool, acrylic edges pressing into my palms, and whispered to the ghost of the man who had built it. You said I'd regret turning my back on this family. But maybe what you really meant was you'd regret turning your back on me. I placed the model back on the table, perfectly centered. Outside, the wind howled softly through the high floors, carrying the faint scent of rain and winter. The storm was coming. I could feel it, but this time I wasn't afraid of it. I turned off the lights, leaving the room bathed in the glow of the city beyond, and walked away knowing that the foundation was shifting again. This time it was in my hands. The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office, spilling across the polished wood like liquid gold. The nameplate on my desk gleamed quietly. Grace Whitmore, Creative Director Honorary. It looked strange there, like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't spent half her life being told she wasn't enough. I stood by the window watching the traffic below, coffee cooling in my hand. The city moved like it always did, steady and different. And yet, something inside me hummed with a new rhythm. This wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about building something that would outlast their doubt. The door creaked open. Nina poked her head in, grinning. I can't believe they actually gave you an office in the Tower of Doom. Theo followed, holding a folder. The old guard must be twitching in their seats. I smiled faintly. Let them twitch. It keeps them awake. We laughed, the sound light and brief, but when they left, the silence settled again. I turned toward the wall of my father's framed awards. The dates stretched back 4 decades. Every plaque read excellence, precision, vision. I wondered if anyone had ever noticed the one word missing: heart. Later that week, the first cracks appeared. It started with delays. Approvals for design concepts that used to take hours now took days. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were mysteriously rescheduled. David and Harper had suddenly developed a talent for administrative oversight. During one meeting, David smiled as he leafed through my presentation slides. You're passionate, Grace. I'll give you that. But we have to make sure these ideas align with company tradition. I folded my hands calmly. Tradition is what's killing us. Innovation is the only tradition worth keeping. The room fell quiet. I could feel the younger designers nodding in silent agreement. Harper crossed her legs and leaned forward. Passion is admirable, but so is practicality. Some of us are here to protect what your father built, not burn it down. I met her gaze. You can't protect what's already rotting, Harper. You can only rebuild it. Her smile wavered, but she said nothing. David cleared his throat and moved on. That night, I stayed late combing through internal project files. What I found made my stomach twist. There were drafts of proposals bearing my designs, altered, rebranded, and credited to David's executive team. The dates were recent. Someone was erasing my work line by line the same way my father once had. I shut my laptop and sat in the dark, the glow of the city flickering against the glass. Rage pulsed under my skin, but I didn't let it spill over. Not yet. I'd learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any scream. Over the next few weeks, I played the part. I showed up to meetings. I smiled. I nodded. And behind closed doors, I began documenting everything: emails, timestamps, transaction records. Each file was another brick in a wall I was quietly building against them. One afternoon, Mr. Lang knocked on my door. He was one of the few board members I trusted, a man whose loyalty had survived my father's temper and the company's politics. "They're cornered," he said softly, taking a seat. "Clients are asking why the designs have lost direction. They're afraid to admit it, but the company needs you." I looked up from my desk. "Then why does it still feel like they're trying to bury me?" He smiled faintly. "Because old power never dies quietly. But give it time, it will choke on its own arrogance." I leaned back, studying him. "Would you support a change in leadership?" He didn't hesitate. "If it means saving Whitmore Designs, yes. But you'll have to move carefully. The board respects results, not rebellion." That night, I drove back to the apartment above Luna Studio. The space felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with half-finished sketches and plants that needed watering. Theo was still there, tapping at his laptop. He looked up when I entered. "Let me guess," he said. "They're being charming again." I dropped my bag. "Worse. They're selling off the company." He froze. I pulled out a file from my coat, copies of internal memos I'd found on Harper's desk. "They're negotiating with an investment firm from Chicago. A full buyout. If it goes through, Whitmore Designs won't belong to our family anymore." Theo swore under his breath. "Do you think your mother knows, maybe?" I said. "But she won't stop him." I sat down, rubbing my temples. "If they sell, they'll erase everything. My father's legacy, my work, all of it." Theo hesitated. "What are you going to do?" I looked up, my voice steady. "Stop them." The next day, I called an old contact, a lawyer I'd met during the Harbor District project. "I need you to look into a potential breach of fiduciary duty," I said. She didn't ask for details. "Send me the documents." By the end of the week, she had enough to confirm it. David and Harper were acting without full board consent. They were trying to push the sale through by falsifying investor reports. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt clarity. I spent the weekend assembling the evidence into a clean, meticulous file. On Monday morning, I sent a single email to the board of directors with the subject line for transparency. No commentary, no accusations. Just facts. By noon, the building was in chaos. Harper stormed into my office, face flushed. "You think this makes you a hero," she hissed. "You just destroyed your own brother." I stood, meeting her fury with calm. "No, he did that himself." David appeared in the doorway a moment later, his voice low and trembling with anger. "You had no right to interfere. You had no right to sell something that isn't yours," I said. "Dad didn't build this company for greed. He built it for legacy." "You forgot that." I didn't. For a second, I saw the boy I used to play with in the backyard, the brother who shared my crayons before he learned to take the credit for my drawings. His expression softened, then hardened again. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but not as much as you will." He left without another word. Harper followed him, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. That evening, Lang called. "You understand what you've done, don't you?" "Yes," I said. "I gave them the rope. Whether they hang themselves or climb out, it's their choice." He chuckled quietly. "The board's convening an emergency meeting tomorrow. Be ready." After the call, I sat by the window, the city glowing beneath me. The storm outside had finally broken, rain streaking down the glass. I thought of the little girl who once begged for her father's approval, the woman who had been called a disgrace at Christmas dinner, and the quiet promise I had made walking away from that table. "You won't have to be ashamed of me again." Now the shame belonged to them. Before leaving the office that night, I sent one final text to my lawyer: "Prepare the recording. We might need it." It was the one I'd made weeks earlier, the conversation between David and Harper discussing their plan to sell. The rain outside turned to mist as I stepped into the elevator. The mirrored walls reflected a woman I almost didn't recognize, calm, composed, unbreakable. By the time the doors opened, my decision was set. Tomorrow, I wasn't just going to defend my place. I was going to take back everything they had: stolen my name, my work, my family's future. The elevator chimed, and as I walked out into the quiet lobby, the words formed clearly in my mind, steady as a heartbeat. They drew the lines. I'll redraw them. The morning of the shareholder meeting dawned gray and windless, the kind of Portland winter sky that seemed to hold its breath before a storm. I woke before sunrise, the city still asleep outside my window. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. On my desk lay the folder that had kept me awake for nights: emails, statements, bank records, and one small flash drive. Everything I needed to end this. I dressed slowly, deliberately. A black suit, no jewelry, no perfume, just precision. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, the woman staring back looked nothing like the one who had walked away from Christmas dinner humiliated a year ago. There was no tremor in her hands, no hesitation in her eyes, only resolve. At 8, my phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Lang. They've arrived early. Be prepared. The meeting was being held in the grand conference hall of Whitmore Tower. The building rose like a shard of glass above the skyline, my father's final monument to perfection. As I stepped inside, memories flickered, trailing behind him as a child, the click of his shoes on the marble, the smell of ink and ambition. Today I walked those same halls on my own terms. The security guard nodded me through his eyes, flicking to my visitor badge. "Good luck, Miss Whitmore," he murmured. Inside the boardroom, 50 shareholders sat in neat rows, the air thick with tension and the low hum of whispered conversation. Cameras from the press lined the back wall. Even the local business journals had caught wind of the brewing chaos. David stood at the podium immaculate in his charcoal suit, flanked by Harper, who looked like she'd rehearsed every smile. Behind them, the Whitmore Designs logo glowed across a massive screen. "Thank you all for coming, David," began his tone steady. "It's been a challenging year, but our legacy stands strong. My father's vision continues through each of us." He gestured toward a slide filled with profit charts and construction photos. His voice flowed smoothly, calculated confidence. But I noticed the slight tremor when he changed slides, the sheen of sweat just starting to gather at his temple. When he spoke about innovation, I almost laughed. The hypocrisy was surgical. At the far end of the table, Lang raised his hand. "Before we continue," he said calmly, "Miss Grace Whitmore has requested to address the board." David froze. Harper turned her head sharply, a brittle smile forming. "This isn't on the agenda," she said. "It is now," Lang replied. Dozens of eyes turned toward me as I stood. My heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound cutting clean through the silence. "Good morning." I began setting a folder on the table. "I promise I'll be brief." David crossed his arms. "Grace, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I said, meeting his gaze. "You've spent the last 6 months talking about legacy. Let's talk about what that actually means." I opened the folder, sliding a series of printed documents across the table toward Lang. These are internal emails showing the unauthorized negotiations between Whitmore Designs and Ralston Capital, an investment firm in Chicago. They detail the proposed sale of controlling shares without full board consent. A ripple of noise filled the room. Harper's face went white. "That's confidential," she snapped. "It's illegal," I corrected. Lang adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. "These are dated 3 months ago." David's voice broke through sharper now. "This is absurd. You don't understand corporate restructuring." "Really?" I said. "Because the financial transfers to Ralston's holding account look less like restructuring and more like theft." Gasps spread down the table. Someone muttered, "Is this verified?" "It will be, Lang," said his voice grave. "Effective immediately." David tried to regain composure. "This is an ambush. You're twisting numbers too." I pressed the remote in my hand, and the screen behind him flickered to life. The audio recording began to play, his voice clear and unmistakable. "Once she's out, we can push the deal through. She'll have no claim left, and Ralston will take the rest." The room erupted. Harper's eyes darted around wildly, her composure cracking. David lunged toward me, his voice shaking. "You had no right to record that. I had every right to protect this company," I said, my tone calm, almost gentle. "The same one our father built. The same one you tried to sell." Lang rose from his seat. "I'm calling for an emergency vote of leadership confidence. Effective immediately." The shareholders began to murmur, hands raising, whispers turning to movement. David's face drained of color. Harper grabbed his arm, whispering something frantic. "You think they'll follow you," he spat. "You've never led anything this size." I looked at him, quiet and steady. "No, but they've followed worse." The vote passed in minutes. The decision was unanimous. David Whitmore was suspended from his role as CEO pending a full investigation. Harper resigned on the spot, her heels echoing down the hall like a retreat. When the room finally emptied, Lang lingered beside me, his voice low. "That was brutal. It was necessary," I said. He nodded. "What will you do now?" I looked toward the massive glass wall overlooking the city. The skyline stretched out beneath the gray clouds, shimmering with rain. "Rebuild," I said simply. By afternoon, the headlines had already hit the news cycle. Whitmore power shift daughter exposes corruption within family empire. The company's stock rose slightly by closing investors responding to the word that terrified David most: transparency. I walked through the corridors in silence, past the portraits of my father and the framed photographs of his early projects. For once, they didn't feel like ghosts. They felt like witnesses. In the design wing, a small crowd of employees had gathered. When they saw me, they fell silent. Then slowly, one of the younger architects began to clap. The others joined, hesitant at first, then louder. The sound filled the space, warm and alive. I didn't speak. I only nodded, the weight of years lifting from my chest. That evening, I released a short statement to the press. Whitmore Designs will honor its founder's vision by returning to its roots, building for people, not power. Legacy is not what we inherit. It's what we choose to protect. When I left the office, the city was blanketed in soft rain. I walked along the river, the lights reflecting off the water in gold and silver ribbons, the same river where I'd scattered my father's ashes just weeks ago. "You were right about one thing," I whispered. "Legacy does matter. But so does change." A cold wind swept across the bridge, carrying my words away into the night. I stopped halfway across, looking back at the skyline, the glass towers glinting like constellations against the storm. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing outside of it. Somewhere behind me, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother: "He'd be proud of you." I smiled, slipping the phone back into my coat pocket. Above the city, thunder rolled softly, distant but certain. The storm had broken, but I was still standing. And this time, the tower that bore our name wasn't my prison. It was the proof that I had never needed their approval to build something that would last. The morning after the storm felt almost too quiet. The city outside my window glowed under a pale winter sun, streets slick with the rain that had washed through the night. I sat by the window of my apartment with a cup of coffee, watching the clouds drift apart, leaving behind a clear blue sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was chasing something. The fight was over, and the silence that followed felt heavy but clean. When I arrived at Whitmore Tower, the building looked different. Maybe it was the way the light caught the glass, or maybe it was the people heads lifted, voices lighter. The security guard smiled as I entered. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. On the top floor, the conference room that had once felt like a battlefield was warm with sunlight. The portraits of past leaders still lined the walls, but their stern faces no longer intimidated me. I was one of them now, though not in the way they'd ever imagined. Employees moved quickly through the halls, exchanging quiet greetings. The tension that had hung over the place like fog was gone. For years, my father had built this company on fear and excellence. Now it was running on hope and respect. And somehow that felt stronger. I spent the morning reviewing reports, approving new design proposals, and answering emails from clients congratulating us on the new era of Whitmore Designs. But the message that stopped me cold came from David. It was short. I'm leaving the city for a while. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know maybe you were right about legacy. I stared at the words for a long time. He hadn't signed his name. He didn't need to. In the afternoon, I drove to my mother's house. The winter light filtered through the bare trees along the drive, scattering across the snow like glass shards. She opened the door before I could knock, wearing a thick gray sweater and the faintest smile. "I didn't think you'd come so soon," she said softly. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But I thought you might like to know what happened." She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The living room was just as I remembered, neat, organized, full of the faint scent of lavender. The same family portrait still hung above the mantel. The same 4 smiles frozen in time. We sat together on the couch. I told her about the meeting, about David's downfall, about the applause that had followed. She listened silently, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, eyes glistening. "He would have hated it," she said finally. "Probably," I said, "but I think deep down he would have understood." She nodded slowly. Then she reached for a small velvet box on the coffee table and handed it to me. Inside was my father's wedding ring, gleaming softly in the light. "He wanted you to have this," she said. I closed the box carefully, feeling the cool weight of it in my palm. "I don't know what to do with it," I admitted. "Maybe just keep it," she said. "Not as a reminder of who he was, but of who you became because of him." Her words sat between us, quiet but full. I looked at her, realizing how much softer she seemed now that the war was over. She wasn't the woman standing behind him anymore, protecting the illusion. She was free, too. Before I left, she hugged me tightly, something she hadn't done since I was a child. "Don't disappear again," she whispered. "You've built something good. Stay close to it." "I will," I said, and meant it. Driving back into the city, I passed the river where I'd scattered his ashes. The current was smooth sunlight glinting off the water's surface. For a moment, I thought about everything that river carried: his ambition, his mistakes, his love twisted with pride, and how in the end, it all flowed the same way. Back at Whitmore Tower, the rebranding event was about to begin. The lobby had been transformed with greenery, soft lighting, and the new logo gleaming across the entrance wall. It wasn't the cold metallic W of the past. Now it intertwined with a crescent, a quiet nod to Luna Studio. When I stepped onto the stage, applause filled the room. I wasn't nervous. My voice carried easily across the crowd. "This company was built on legacy," I began. "But legacy is only as strong as the people who carry it forward. We've spent decades building walls, trying to stand taller than everyone else. Now we're building bridges to connect, to listen, to create." Behind me, the screen shifted to images of our new projects: sustainable housing, public libraries, community gardens. Each design held warmth, humanity, proof that architecture could be more than glass and concrete. When the applause quieted, I added, "The future of Whitmore Designs isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone who believes that art and empathy can share the same space. My father built the skyline. Together we'll build the city's heart." The crowd rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. I caught Theo's eye in the front row, and he grinned like we'd made it through a war. Nina was beside him, clapping furiously, tears shining in her eyes. After the event, I slipped out to the balcony overlooking downtown. The air was cold, the wind carrying the scent of snow and steel. Below me, the streets buzzed with evening traffic lights flickering like embers. I heard footsteps behind me. Aunt Margaret leaned against the railing, wrapped in her wool coat. "You made quite the speech," she said. I smiled. "You came all this way. Wouldn't miss it," she said. "Besides, I wanted to see the look on their faces when you said bridges instead of walls." We both laughed. She looked out over the city, her expression thoughtful. "You know, I think your father would have been proud. Not because you saved the company, but because you did it without becoming him." I didn't answer right away. I just watched the skyline glowing gold against the fading light. "Maybe that's the best way to honor him," I said finally. "By building something he never could." She reached over, squeezing my hand. "You already have." When she left, I stayed on the balcony a little longer, the wind tugging at my hair. the tower lights reflected off the river below, endless and bright. That night I drove home through the quiet streets. The city felt new again, alive in a way it hadn't in years. As I pulled into my apartment lot, a light snow began to fall, flakes spinning through the headlights, like silver dust. I stood outside for a moment, letting the cold touch my face, my breath rising in small clouds. For years I'd carried the weight of being the family disgrace, the outcast, the disappointment. Now there was no weight left, only space. I looked up at the sky, at the faint stars barely visible through the city's glow, and whispered, "We're done, Dad. You can rest now." Then I turned and walked inside, the snow melting in my hair, ready for whatever came next. Spring arrived in Portland, with soft light and clean air, the kind that made the city look almost new again. The Willamette River shimmered under the sun as I crossed the bridge toward the new community center. The bronze plaque at the entrance caught the morning light, designed by Whitmore Designs and Luna Studio, in memory of Charles Whitmore. Children's laughter drifted through the open windows, the smell of fresh paint still faint in the air. Inside, the walls were lined with color murals of families, rivers, skylines, hands holding one another. I paused at the doorway of the art room where a small boy stood painting a house with bright red walls. He turned and grinned at me. "It's where my mom says we'll live someday," he said proudly. I smiled. "It's beautiful." Walking through the building, I realized every wall told a story, not of power or perfection, but of people who had refused to give up. And maybe that was what this place was meant to be all along, not a monument, but a beginning. A woman approached me, a journalist from the Portland Review. She had been following the progress of the project for weeks. "Miss Whitmore," she said, notebook in hand, "do you ever feel like you've rebuilt your father's company?" I looked around at the sunlight spilling through the glass ceiling. "No," I said. "I didn't rebuild it. I changed what it meant." She smiled. "One last question. If you could speak to your younger self, the one who left this city years ago, what would you tell her?" I thought of that night in the snow, the sound of my father's voice calling me a disgrace, the cold that had burned through my coat as I walked away. I remembered how small I'd felt, how invisible. "I'd tell her she was never a disgrace," I said softly. "She was just ahead of her time." The journalist lowered her pen, her eyes bright. "Thank you," she whispered. Later that afternoon, I drove past the house where everything had started. The hedges were different now, the porch painted blue, a new family living inside. A woman in a red sweater was playing with her daughter in the yard. Their laughter echoed down the street. I parked for a moment, watching from the car. The window where my old bedroom used to be was open, curtains fluttering in the breeze. For the first time, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt gratitude for the years that had broken me, for the strength they'd carved into my bones. I left an envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a photo of my family before the years had turned sharp, before ambition had hardened us. On the back I'd written, "We were imperfect, but we built something that survived us." Then I drove away without looking back. That evening, my home was filled with warmth and laughter. The long dining table glowed under soft candlelight plates, stacked with food music playing faintly from the kitchen. Nina and Theo were arguing over the best playlist. Aunt Margaret poured wine into mismatched glasses, and the air felt like it had waited a lifetime for this kind of peace. As everyone settled, I stood and raised my glass. The chatter faded into a comfortable hush. "A year ago," I began, "someone looked me in the eye at Christmas dinner and said I was the biggest disgrace to our family. And for a long time I believed it. But now I know sometimes being a disgrace just means you refuse to live small." Laughter and applause rippled around the table. Aunt Margaret raised her glass high. "To Grace," she said, smiling through tears. "The woman who turned shame into light." We clinked glasses, the sound bright and full. Later, after everyone left, I stood by the window with the city lights glowing in the distance. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried meaning. On the wall above my desk hung a framed piece of paper, a sketch I had drawn when I was 8 years old. A crooked house with a big yellow sun above it. That house had followed me everywhere, through humiliation, defiance, rebuilding. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was the first thing I ever created just for me. And now it felt like a prophecy. I traced my finger over the frame. This was always the dream, I whispered. Outside, the river shimmered under the moonlight. The buildings I'd helped design stood in the distance, each one different, each one alive. I thought about my father, how much of him lived in the concrete and glass of this city, how much of him lived in me. "I did it, Dad," I said quietly. "But I did it my way." The wind brushed against the window pane, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the streets below. For the first time, I felt like everything had come full circle. Not revenge, not victory, just peace. I turned off the lights, leaving the warm glow of the city as the only illumination. The skyline stretched out beyond the glass, alive, resilient, and endless. Have you ever been told you'd never be enough, only to prove them wrong just by becoming yourself? Because maybe that's what every story like mine is about, not vengeance but redemption. Not tearing others down but rising until the silence no longer hurts. Tell me, what did you rebuild after they tried to break you? If this story reminded you of your own, share it below. Someone out there needs to hear how you survived, how you turned the pain into something beautiful. And if you believe, like I do, that dignity always finds its way home, stay with us. There are more stories to tell. The camera lingers on the city skyline for a final moment, the faint hum of life below, mixing with the soft sound of the river. Then, slowly, the light fades to black.